Welcome back to HOA Karma Files. I asked for records, and they panicked. I am sending this email right now, Teresa said, waving her phone in my face while her other hand gripped a spiral-bound notebook, covered in handwritten notes and random sticky tabs. She was standing in the middle of the mailbox cluster at Briarstone Estates Association in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, blocking my path to my own mailbox, and she was absolutely furious because I had just asked her why my guest parking invoice did not match any approved fee schedule I could find in the Officey AL portal. The wind gusted hard enough to whip the corner of her notebook open, and she slammed it shut like I had tried to peek at state secrets. Teresa Lewis, communications director for the HOA board, loved two things: control and paperwork that only she could interpret. She jabbed her finger at the notebook and said the handwritten logs outranked everything else, including the management company database, the board meeting minutes, and apparently the laws of Pennsylvania. I am a data analyst. I track patterns and timelines for a living, and I was recovering from a knee injury that made standing in gusty parking lots while someone yelled at me about imaginary fees physically painful and emotionally exhausting. I leaned on my cane and stayed calm, which only made her angrier. She said if I did not pay the guest parking penalty by end of business today, she would authorize a tow on my vehicle and my guest vehicles, and she would CC the entire neighborhood email list so everyone would know I was a problem resident. She held up a laminated sheet with the tow company logo and said, "We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works." I nodded and asked if I could take a photo of the invoice for my records. She pulled it back and said I could request it formally through the portal, which she knew was down for maintenance and had been down for 3 days. That was the moment I realized this was not about guest parking at all. 3 years ago, another resident named Marcus had been hit with the exact same fee structure, the exact same tow threat, and the exact same records request denial. He paid under protest and moved out 6 months later, and the whole thing disappeared into the neighborhood rumor mill as just another HOA horror story. But I remembered it because I had helped him pull portal screenshots before he gave up, and those screenshots were still on my laptop. The fee Marcus paid never appeared in any board-approved budget line. It just vanished. And now Teresa was trying it again. On me, with the same playbook and the same confidence. I let her talk, because every word was helping me. She said the fee was non-negotiable and the timeline was firm, and if I wanted to dispute it, I would need to submit a formal appeal at the next board meeting, which was not scheduled until after the payment deadline. She said, "This conversation is not a debate, it is a directive." Then she turned and walked toward the management office trailer at the edge of the parking lot, and I could see her already typing on her phone, probably drafting the public shaming email she had just threatened. I went home and opened my laptop. I pulled the old screenshots from the Marcus case and compared them to my current invoice. Same line item description, same dollar amount, same vague reference to a policy section that did not exist in the uploaded CC&R documents. But this time, I had something Marcus did not have. I had spent the last 2 years befriending people Teresa had burned, including a community mail carrier named Damon, who had watched her post violation notices on doors late at night and photographed them the next morning to make the timestamps look official. Damon had told me 6 months ago that Teresa kept a separate violation log in her car, a handwritten binder she updated between routes, and she would sometimes write entries with yesterday's date to make it look like she had documented things in real time. He thought it was weird but not illegal, and he did not want trouble, so he never said anything formally. But now I had a use for that detail. I texted Damon and asked if he had ever seen Teresa filling out that log while sitting in the management office parking lot. He said yes, multiple times, always right after a board meeting when the lot was empty. I asked if he remembered any specific dates, and he sent me 3, all within a week of budget meetings where spending reports were presented. I pulled the board meeting minutes from those dates and cross-referenced them with the uploaded budget line items. 2 of the meetings had minutes that listed a facilities discussion, but the uploaded budgets had no matching facilities expense. The 3rd meeting had minutes that mentioned a vote on updated parking enforcement, but the vote tally was missing and the policy text was not attached. That was clue number 1. Teresa was manipulating minutes and agendas to erase objections after the meeting. The question was whether she was doing it alone or whether the management company was helping her. I filed a records request through the portal the next morning, asking for the original board meeting recordings and the unedited draft minutes from those 3 meetings. The portal automatically generated a confirmation email and CC'd the management company and the board secretary. Within 2 hours, Teresa replied all and said the recordings were not retained per the retention policy, and the draft minutes were internal working documents not subject to disclosure. She attached a PDF of the retention policy, which I opened immediately. The policy said meeting recordings were kept for 90 days unless a formal dispute was filed. The meetings I was asking about were over a year old, but Marcus had filed a formal fee dispute at the time, which meant the recordings should have been retained. I replied all and quoted the dispute exception, and I attached a screenshot of Marcus's dispute confirmation email from the portal, which I still had because he had forwarded it to me when he was trying to build his case. Teresa did not reply. The board secretary did not reply. But the management company regional supervisor, a man named Colin, replied privately and said he would look into it and get back to me within 5 business days. That was progress, but 5 business days was too slow. The payment deadline Teresa had given me was tomorrow, and if I missed it, she would escalate immediately and I would lose the procedural high ground. I needed leverage, and I needed it today. So I went to the one place Teresa could not control, the county recorder's office. Briarstone Estates Association was required to file annual reports and updated governing documents with the county, and those filings were public record. I drove downtown, waited 20 minutes in line, and requested every filing from the last 4 years. The clerk handed me a file cart with printouts and said I could scan them at the copy station for 10 cents a page. I found it in the 3rd binder, a 2022 annual report that listed all active board members and their assigned roles. Teresa was listed as communications director, but there was a handwritten note in the margin next to her name that said proxy authority revised per 8/14 vote. I checked the 2023 report, and the note was gone, but Teresa's title had expanded to include records coordinator. That was clue number 2. Teresa had gained official control over records retention and minute distribution, which gave her the access and cover to rewrite history. But the proxy authority revision was interesting, because I remembered Marcus mentioning that his appeal was denied on a proxy vote. He said he never got to speak at the meeting, and when he checked the minutes later, his agenda item was listed as withdrawn by mutual agreement. He insisted he never agreed to anything, but he had no proof, and the board said the minutes were final. I photographed every page of the annual reports, paid for the scans, and drove to the Briarstone management office. It was a double-wide trailer at the back of the neighborhood near the retention pond, and it shared a parking lot with the pool equipment shed and the mail hub. Teresa's car was there, parked in the spot closest to the door, which was not an assigned spot, but everyone knew not to take it, because Teresa would send a violation notice within an hour. I parked 2 spaces down and waited. Teresa came out 6 minutes later carrying a tablet and a zippered portfolio. She saw me and stopped, and her expression shifted from surprised to furious in less than a second. She walked over and said, "If you are here to contest the fee in person, you are too late." The deadline was extended to end of business, and it is currently 4:47, which means you have 13 minutes. I stayed in my car and said I was not contesting the fee. I was requesting a meeting with Colin to discuss records retention compliance. She said Colin was not available, and I would need to schedule through the portal. I said the portal was still down and I had a legal right to request access in person. She said, "This conversation is not a debate, it is a directive," and turned to walk back inside. I got out of my car and said I had evidence that board meeting minutes had been altered post-approval, and I was giving the management company one chance to review it before I forwarded it to the homeowners and the state HOA ombudsman. Teresa stopped. She did not turn around, but her shoulders went rigid and I could see her fingers tighten on the portfolio. She turned around and said, "You have no evidence of anything, because there is nothing to find. The minutes are approved by the board and signed by the secretary, and if you are accusing me of misconduct, you better have a lawyer." I said I was not accusing anyone yet. I was offering the management company a chance to investigate internally before this became a compliance issue. She walked closer and said, "What compliance issue?" Everything we do is documented and transparent. Show me one shred of proof. I opened my phone and pulled up the scanned county filing with the proxy authority note. I held it up so she could see the image and I said, "This note says your proxy authority was revised in August 2022. What does that mean? And why was it removed from the next year's filing?" She glanced at the screen, and I saw her jaw tighten. She said, "That was a clerical error. It was corrected in the updated draft." I said, "So the updated draft removed the note, but kept your expanded title as Records Coordinator?" She said, "I was appointed Records Coordinator because the previous coordinator resigned, and the board voted to consolidate roles." I said, "Great. Can I see the meeting minutes from that vote?" She said the minutes were in the portal, and I could request them formally. I said the portal was down, and I was requesting them in person right now under Pennsylvania Open Records law. She said the management office was not subject to open records requests because it was a private contractor, and I would need to submit my request to the board secretary. I said fine, I would email the board secretary and CC every homeowner on the community list, and I would attach the county filing, and ask why the proxy revision was not disclosed in any meeting minutes or quarterly updates. That got her. She said, "Do not threaten me with mass emails. That is harassment, and I will report you to the board." I said I was not threatening anyone. I was exercising my right to communicate with my neighbors about HOA governance. She stepped closer, and I could smell her perfume and see the small tremble in her hands. She said, "You do not understand how this works. You think you can dig up some old filing and embarrass the board, but all you are doing is making yourself a target." I have been managing communications for this HOA for 5 years, and I know every rule, every loophole, and every pressure point. You are recovering from an injury, you work long hours, and you do not have time for a fight. Pay the fee, move on, and stop digging where you do not belong. I let her finish, and then I said, "I am not paying a fee that does not exist. And I am not moving on while you rewrite meeting minutes to cover up vendor kickbacks or fake line items. If the board wants to audit the last 3 years of budget reports and prove me wrong, I will apologize in writing. But if they do not, I am going to assume you have something to hide, and I am going to keep digging until I find it." Her face went red. She said, "You just admitted you are harassing the board, and I am documenting this conversation." She pulled out her phone and held it up like she was recording, but the screen was black. I said, "Go ahead. I am documenting it too, and my recording is actually running." I held up my phone, which was recording audio in my voice memo app, and I watched her expression crack for just a second before she forced it back to anger. She turned and walked to her car without another word. She got in, slammed the door, and sat there typing on her phone for a full minute before driving away. I stayed in the parking lot and called Damon. I told him what just happened, and I asked if he still had any photos from the nights he saw Teresa posting notices. He said he had a few on his old phone, and he could dig them up if I needed them. I said I needed them, and I needed them tonight. He sent me 4 photos at 9 p.m. 3 of them showed Teresa's car parked at random cluster mailboxes at night, always between 10 and 11 p.m., with her interior light on and papers visible on the passenger seat. The 4th photo was a close shot of a violation notice taped to a door, and the timestamp in the corner of Damon's phone screen showed it was taken at 10:42 p.m. on a Wednesday. The notice itself had a violation date printed as the previous Monday, which meant Teresa had backdated it by 2 days. That was clue number 3. Teresa was not just rewriting minutes, she was manufacturing violations with fake timestamps to justify fees and tow authorizations. The guest parking fee she hit me with was probably the same scam, a violation that never happened, documented in her handwritten log with whatever date she needed, and enforced with threats and procedural tricks. I had enough to go public, but I did not have the trump card yet. I needed something that would flip the entire power dynamic, something Teresa could not deny or rewrite. And I knew where to find it. The budget meeting from 2022 was the key. Marcus's fee dispute had been tied to that meeting, and Teresa's proxy authority revision had happened the same month. If I could find evidence that she had used her proxy authority to vote down Marcus's appeal while simultaneously hiding the fee from the official budget report, I could prove intent and pattern. But the meeting recording was supposedly gone, per Teresa's retention policy loophole. Except the retention policy had a second exception I had not mentioned to Teresa. Any meeting where a quorum was challenged or a vote was contested had to be recorded and archived indefinitely. I pulled the August 2022 minutes and read them line by line. Buried in the attendance section was a note, "Quorum achieved via proxy per revised authority memo." That meant the meeting had barely hit quorum, and Teresa's proxy votes were the deciding factor, which meant the recording was not just retained, it was legally required to be archived. I emailed Colin directly and said I was formally requesting the archived recording of the August 14th, 2022 board meeting under the contested vote exception. I cited the specific policy section. I attached a screenshot of the quorum note, and I CC'd the board president and the board secretary. I did not CC Teresa. Colin replied in less than an hour. He said the recording was archived off-site and would take 3 business days to retrieve, and he would notify me when it was available for review. He also said he had reviewed my earlier records request and determined that the draft minutes I requested were subject to disclosure, and he would provide them by end of week. He apologized for the delay and said the management company took compliance seriously. That was the crack I needed. Colin was covering his own liability, which meant he did not trust Teresa's version of events, and he was giving me access to the evidence before she could destroy it. The next morning, I received a certified letter at my door. It was from an attorney named Gerald Moss, representing the Briarstone Estates Association Board of Directors, and it demanded immediate payment of the guest parking fee, plus a late penalty and administrative costs, totaling $412. The letter said failure to pay within 72 hours would result in a lien filing and suspension of my homeowner voting rights. It was full of bluff language meant to scare me into paying instantly, and it worked exactly as intended. I got angry, which made me focused. I photographed the letter, checked the postmark, and noticed it was mailed the same day I confronted Teresa in the parking lot. She had escalated within hours, which meant she was panicking. That was good. Panic led to mistakes. I called Gerald Moss's office and asked to speak with him directly. The receptionist said he was in court and would return my call by end of business. I said I would hold, and I stayed on the line for 11 minutes until she transferred me. Gerald picked up and said, "This is Gerald Moss. What can I do for you?" I said I received his demand letter regarding a guest parking fee, and I wanted to clarify the legal basis for the fee before I responded. He said the fee was authorized under the association's parking enforcement policy, and the board had directed him to pursue collection. I said, "Which section of the parking enforcement policy, and when was the board vote authorizing the fee?" There was a long pause, and then he said, "I will need to check with my client and get back to you." I said, "That is fine, but I am also going to need copies of the meeting minutes authorizing the fee, the policy section you are citing, and the vote tally, because I believe the fee was never approved, and the policy section does not exist." He said, "Are you represented by counsel?" I said no, I was just a homeowner doing my own research. He said, "I recommend you retain an attorney if you intend to dispute this matter." I said I would consider it, and I hung up. Gerald called me back 2 hours later and said he had reviewed the matter with the board and determined that the fee was part of a pilot parking enforcement program that had been discussed in executive session, and therefore the minutes were not subject to disclosure. I said executive session minutes were only exempt if they involved personnel matters, litigation, or contract negotiations, and a parking fee policy did not qualify. He said the board had discretion to interpret the exemption, and I could appeal to the board if I disagreed. I said, "So you are telling me the fee was approved in a secret meeting, the policy does not exist in writing, and my only recourse is to appeal to the same board that hired you to collect the fee?" He said, "That is correct, and if you do not pay within the deadline, I will proceed with the lien filing." I said, "Go ahead, and I will file a complaint with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office and the county recorder alleging financial misconduct and fraud. And I will attach every piece of evidence I have showing that this fee was never approved by a recorded vote." He paused again, and then he said, "I will relay your position to my client." The call ended. That night, I received an email from the board president, a retired accountant named Paul, asking me to attend a special executive session meeting to discuss my concerns. The meeting was scheduled for Friday at 6 p.m. at the management office. I replied and said I would attend, and I requested that the meeting be recorded per association policy. Paul replied and said executive sessions were not recorded. I replied again and said I would bring my own recording device and I expected the meeting to be conducted in good faith. He did not reply. Friday arrived and I spent the day organizing my evidence into a single binder. The county filings, the Marcus screenshots, Damon's photos, the August 2022 quorum note, Colin's email confirming the archived recording, Gerald's demand letter, and a printed timeline showing every escalation step Teresa had taken. I also printed a copy of the Pennsylvania Uniform Plan Community Act sections on meeting minutes, voting transparency, and owner rights. I wanted everything in front of me, on paper, where no one could claim technical difficulties or portal outages. I arrived at the management office at 5:58 p.m. Paul was already inside, along with the board secretary, a woman named Diane, and the treasurer, a man named Frank. Teresa was not there, and neither was Colin. I asked where Teresa was, and Paul said she had recused herself from the meeting due to a conflict of interest. I said, "What conflict of interest?" He said, "She is the subject of your complaint, so it is appropriate for her to recuse." I said, "That is fine, but I want it noted that she was not present." If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Paul gestured to a folding chair and said, "Please have a seat. We appreciate you coming in to discuss this matter." I sat down and placed my binder on the table. Paul said, "We have reviewed your records requests and your communications with our attorney, and we want to resolve this amicably. The board believes there has been a misunderstanding regarding the guest parking fee, and we are prepared to waive the fee and the penalties if you agree to withdraw your complaints and your records requests." I said, "I appreciate the offer, but I am not withdrawing anything until I get answers. I want to know why the fee was never listed in the approved budget, why the meeting minutes do not show a vote authorizing the fee, and why Teresa has been backdating violation notices and rewriting minutes after board approval." Paul looked at Diane, and Diane looked at Frank, and no one said anything for a long moment. Finally, Frank said, "We are not aware of any backdated notices or rewritten minutes. If you have evidence of that, we would like to see it." I opened my binder and slid Damon's photos across the table. I said, "These photos show Teresa posting violation notices at 10 p.m. and backdating them by 2 days. I also have county filings showing that she was given proxy authority and records coordinator access in the same month that a previous resident, Marcus, was charged the same guest parking fee and denied an appeal. I have draft minutes from Colin showing that the fee was discussed but never voted on. And I have an archived recording request pending that will show Teresa used proxy votes to shut down Marcus's appeal." Paul picked up the photos and studied them. Diane leaned over to look, and her face went pale. Frank said, "Where did you get these?" I said, "A witness who saw Teresa manufacturing violations in real time." Paul said, "This is a serious allegation." I said, "I know, and I am giving you a chance to investigate internally before I go public. If the board wants to audit Teresa's records and correct the violations, I will work with you. But if you try to cover this up or retaliate against me, I will file complaints with every oversight body I can find, and I will make sure every homeowner in this neighborhood knows what happened." Paul set the photos down and said, "We need time to review this." I said, "You have until Monday." On Monday, I am forwarding everything to the state HOA ombudsman, the county recorder, and the neighborhood email list, and I am requesting a full financial audit of every fee Teresa has collected in the last 3 years. If you want to get ahead of that, you need to act now. Diane said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want the fee canceled. I want the demand letter withdrawn. I want Teresa removed from records access. And I want a requirement that board meetings record audio officially, so minutes cannot be rewritten. I also want a written apology and a commitment that no homeowner will be charged unapproved fees going forward." Paul said, "That is a significant ask." I said, "It is a fair ask, and it is less than what I am entitled to under state law." Frank said, "If we agree to your terms, will you sign a release?" I said, "No. I will agree not to pursue individual legal action against the board members if you act in good faith, but I am not releasing my right to file regulatory complaints if Teresa or anyone else retaliates." Paul said, "We will discuss this with the board and get back to you by Sunday." I stood up and said, "One more thing. I know Teresa is not here, but I want you to know that I recorded our parking lot conversation on Wednesday, and I have her on tape admitting that she uses her access to target homeowners and pressure them into compliance. If this board tries to protect her, that recording goes public." Paul's face went stiff, and he said, "Understood." I left the meeting and drove home. I did not hear from Paul on Saturday, but on Sunday afternoon I received an email from Colin. He said the board had voted in an emergency session to suspend Teresa's records coordinator role pending an internal investigation, and the management company would be conducting a full audit of meeting minutes and fee collections from the last 3 years. He also said the guest parking fee had been voided, the demand letter had been withdrawn, and Gerald Moss had been instructed to close the file. He apologized for the inconvenience and said the board was committed to transparency and compliance going forward. I replied and said I appreciated the swift action, but I wanted confirmation that the investigation would include Teresa's use of proxy votes and backdated violations. Colin replied within an hour and said the investigation scope had been expanded to include those issues, and the board would provide a summary report to all homeowners within 30 days. That was progress, but it was not the end game. I still needed the trump card, and I still needed to deploy it in a way that would force permanent accountability. So I waited for the archived recording. It arrived on Tuesday. Colin emailed me a secure link to download the audio file from the August 14th, 2022 board meeting. I downloaded it immediately, opened it in an audio editor, and started scrubbing through the timeline. The meeting was 2 hours and 14 minutes long, and most of it was routine budget updates and landscape contract renewals. But at the 1 hour 37-minute mark, I heard Teresa's voice. She said, "I move to deny the appeal filed by Marcus Chen regarding the guest parking enforcement fee, on the grounds that the fee is authorized under the pilot program approved in executive session, and the appeal is untimely per the revised deadline." Paul said, "Is there a second?" Frank said, "I second." Paul said, "All in favor?" There was a pause, and then Teresa said, "I am casting proxy votes on behalf of board members Riley and Hassan, who are absent tonight. Both vote yes." Paul said, "Motion carries 4-1. There it was. Teresa had used proxy votes to deny Marcus's appeal, and she had justified the fee by citing a phantom executive session that no one else mentioned. But the best part was what came next. Diane said, "For the record, I want to note that I do not believe we ever formally approved this pilot program, and I would like to see documentation of the executive session where it was authorized." Teresa said, "The documentation is in my records binder, and I will provide it at the next meeting." Diane said, "I would like it provided now." Teresa said, "I do not have it with me." Paul said, "Let us table this discussion and move on to the next agenda item." The documentation was never provided, because it did not exist. Teresa had invented the pilot program, used her proxy votes to ram through the denial, and then stonewalled any follow-up questions. And now I had her voice on a permanent record admitting that the documentation was in her personal binder, not in the official HOA files. I clipped the relevant section of the audio, saved it as a separate file, and emailed it to Colin with a subject line that said, "Evidence of proxy vote abuse and fraudulent fee justification, August 2022 meeting." I CC'd Paul, Diane, Frank, and the state HOA ombudsman. I did not CC Teresa. In the email body I wrote, "This recording proves that Teresa Lewis used proxy votes to deny a homeowner appeal for a fee that was never approved by the board, and she claimed the fee was authorized in an executive session that has no documentation. I am formally requesting that the board void all fees collected under this pilot program, refund affected homeowners, and implement a requirement that board meetings record audio officially so minutes cannot be rewritten. I am also requesting that Teresa be removed from all board positions and proxy authority be revoked permanently. Please confirm receipt and provide a timeline for corrective action." Colin replied within 30 minutes and said the email had been forwarded to the board attorney and the management company's compliance team, and he would schedule a special board meeting to address the findings. He said the meeting would be open to all homeowners and would be recorded per my request. He thanked me for bringing the matter to the management company's attention and said they were committed to resolving it fully. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 p.m., and it was held in the community center instead of the management office because the board expected a large turnout. I arrived early and set up my phone to record from the back row. By 7 p.m., the room was packed. Damon was there, along with Marcus, who had driven in from his new neighborhood an hour away, and at least 40 other homeowners, many of whom I recognized from the neighborhood email list wars. Paul opened the meeting and said the board had completed its preliminary investigation into records management and fee collection practices, and the findings required immediate corrective action. He said Teresa Lewis had been removed from her role as communications director and records coordinator, effective immediately, and her proxy authority had been revoked. He said the guest parking enforcement pilot program had been determined to be unauthorized, and all fees collected under that program would be refunded within 30 days. He also said the board was implementing a new policy requiring all meetings to be audio recorded and archived indefinitely, and draft minutes would be published within 72 hours of each meeting for homeowner review before approval. There was applause from the back of the room. Paul continued and said the management company had identified multiple instances where meeting minutes were altered post-approval, and those minutes would be corrected and republished with a changelog showing what was edited and why. He said the board was also conducting a financial audit to determine whether any other fees or line items had been collected without proper authorization, and the results would be shared with homeowners within 60 days. Then Teresa stood up. She was sitting in the second row, and she had been silent until that moment. She said, "I would like to address the allegations before this board votes to destroy my reputation." Paul said, "Teresa, you have been given the opportunity to respond in writing, and your statement is part of the investigation record." Teresa said, "My statement was ignored, and this entire process has been a witch hunt led by one disgruntled homeowner who has a personal vendetta." She pointed at me. She said, "He has harassed me, recorded me without consent, and filed false complaints to intimidate the board. And now you are rewarding him by caving to his demands." Paul said, "Teresa, please sit down." Teresa said, "No, I will not sit down while my integrity is being assassinated. I have served this board for 5 years, and I have done nothing but follow policy and enforce the rules fairly. If there were errors in the minutes, they were clerical mistakes, not fraud. If there were issues with the pilot program, they were the result of poor communication, not intentional misconduct. And if this board is going to destroy my reputation based on the accusations of one person, then I demand a formal hearing with the right to cross-examine witnesses." Paul said, "You are entitled to a hearing if you want one, but the board has already determined that your access to records and proxy authority created conflicts of interest that compromise the integrity of our governance. That is not a witch hunt. That is a compliance issue." Teresa said, "You are scapegoating me to avoid liability, and I will not accept that." She looked at me and said, "You recorded me without consent, and that is illegal in Pennsylvania. I am filing a complaint with the police." I stood up and said, "Pennsylvania is a one-party consent state, which means I am allowed to record any conversation I am part of without notifying you. I also have witnesses who saw you backdating notices and manipulating minutes, and I have an archived meeting recording where you used proxy votes to deny an appeal for a fee that did not exist. If you want to file a police complaint, go ahead, but you are not going to like where that investigation leads." Teresa's face went red, and she started to respond, but Paul cut her off and said, "That is enough. This is not a debate, and we are not going to turn this meeting into a shouting match. Teresa, if you have additional evidence to present, you can submit it in writing to the board attorney. Otherwise, please sit down or leave." Teresa grabbed her bag and walked out, slamming the door behind her. The room was silent for a moment, and then someone in the third row said, "Good riddance." There was scattered laughter, and Paul said, "Let us move on to the corrective action plan." The board voted unanimously to approve the refunds, the audio recording policy, and the minute correction process. They also voted to terminate the HOA's vendor relationship with the tow company that Teresa had been using, because the audit revealed that Teresa had a personal relationship with the tow dispatcher and had been authorizing tows without board approval. That was the HOA consequence. The vendor relationship tied to the abuse was canceled, and the tow authorizations were voided retroactively. At the end of the meeting, the board attorney, a woman named Ellen, stood up and said she wanted to clarify the legal standard for future enforcement actions. She said, "Going forward, any fee or penalty imposed by this association must be authorized by a recorded board vote, documented in the approved minutes, and listed in the published fee schedule. No board member or contractor has the authority to create fees unilaterally, and any attempt to do so will be treated as unauthorized and void. If a homeowner believes they have been charged an invalid fee, they have the right to request documentation and appeal to the board without penalty." She looked at the front row where Teresa had been sitting and said, "That applies to everyone, including board members." That was the Karen consequence. Teresa got corrected by the HOA attorney in plain language, and her favorite fee was proven imaginary in the ledger. The meeting ended at 9 p.m., and I stayed behind to talk to Marcus. He said, "I cannot believe you actually did it. I spent 6 months fighting that fee, and they buried me with procedural delays and lawyer letters. You reopened the whole thing and took them down in 2 weeks." I said, "You did the groundwork, I just had better timing and a better understanding of their weak spots." He said, "What are you going to do with the recording?" I said, "I am keeping it as insurance, and if Teresa or anyone else tries to retaliate, I will send it to every news outlet in Pittsburgh and let them run with the HOA corruption angle." He laughed and said, "You are going to make a lot of enemies." I said, "I already did." Damon found me in the parking lot and said, "I heard Teresa is threatening to sue you for defamation." I said, "Let her try. Everything I said is documented, and I have witnesses and recordings to back it up. If she wants to go to court, she will have to explain under oath why she was backdating notices and rewriting minutes. And I do not think her attorney is going to let her do that." Damon said, "You are probably right." He handed me a flash drive and said, "I pulled every photo I have of her doing shady stuff in the neighborhood. I do not know if you need it, but it is yours if you want it." I said thanks, and I told him I owed him a beer. The next morning, I received an email from Teresa. It was sent from her personal account, not her HOA email, and it said, "You have destroyed my reputation and cost me my volunteer position on a board I have served faithfully for 5 years. I hope you are proud of yourself." I did not reply. 3 days later, the board sent a formal apology letter to all homeowners, acknowledging that the guest parking enforcement pilot program was never properly authorized and that several homeowners had been charged invalid fees. The letter included a refund schedule and a commitment to improve transparency. It also announced that the board was implementing a requirement that board meetings record audio officially, so minutes cannot be rewritten, and that the audio would be archived and available to homeowners on request. That was the payback vector I had demanded, and the board delivered it in writing. The audit results came back 6 weeks later. The financial review found that Teresa had collected over $11,000 in unauthorized fees from 19 homeowners over a 3-year period, using a combination of backdated violations, phantom policy citations, and proxy vote manipulation. The fees were refunded in full, with interest, and the board issued a second apology letter acknowledging systemic failures in oversight and records management. The letter also announced that Teresa had resigned from all HOA roles and would not be eligible for re-election or appointment to any future board positions. I ran into Teresa one more time, about 2 months after the final board meeting. I was at the grocery store and I saw her in the frozen foods aisle. She saw me at the same time, and her expression went from neutral to hostile in an instant. She said, "I hope you are happy. You cost me my position, my reputation, and my relationships in this neighborhood." I said, "You cost yourself all of that when you decided to rewrite minutes and charge fake fees." She said, "I never charged fake fees. I enforced the rules as I understood them. I said, then you should have understood them better, because what you did was fraud. She stepped closer and said, this conversation is not a debate, it is a directive. I said, that line does not work anymore, Teresa. You do not have a board title, you do not have proxy authority, and you do not have access to the records. You are just another homeowner now, and if you want to dispute anything, you will have to follow the same process as everyone else. She stared at me for a long moment, and then she turned and walked away without another word. The HOA held new board elections 3 months later, and I ran for a seat. I did not campaign hard. I just put my name on the ballot and sent one email to the neighborhood list explaining why I was running. I wanted to make sure the transparency reforms stuck, and I wanted to hold the board accountable for following its own rules. I won by a comfortable margin, and so did 2 other homeowners who had been vocal critics of the old board's practices. At my first meeting as a board member, Paul announced that he was stepping down as president and endorsing me to replace him. I declined and said I thought Diane would do a better job, and the board voted her in unanimously. My role became compliance officer, which meant I was responsible for making sure meeting minutes matched the audio recordings, fee schedules matched the approved budgets, and no one tried to rewrite history again. It was not glamorous, but it was exactly the kind of oversight the neighborhood needed. Teresa moved out of Briarstone 6 months later. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she sold her house and relocated to a townhouse community in the suburbs. I do not know if she joined that HOA board, but I hope she learned something from what happened here. The funny karma moment came about a year after the audit, when the board was reviewing the updated budget and someone noticed a line item labeled Communications Coordinator Stipend, $500 per quarter. Diane asked where that line item came from, and Frank said it had been in the budget since 2021 and no one had questioned it. I pulled the original budget draft and compared it to the approved version, and the stipend was not in the draft. It had been added after approval, during the minute finalization process, which was exactly when Teresa had records coordinator access. We dug deeper and found that Teresa had been paying herself a quarterly stipend for 3 years, totaling $6,000, and no one had noticed because the line item was vague and buried in the administrative section. The stipend was never authorized by a vote, and there was no contract or service agreement justifying it. It was just Teresa paying herself for a job she was already volunteering to do. That was Teresa's favorite fee, and it got proven imaginary in the ledger during a routine budget review. The board voted to demand repayment, and Teresa's attorney sent a settlement offer 3 weeks later. She repaid $4,000, and the board agreed not to pursue the remaining balance or file a fraud complaint. I voted no on the settlement, but I was outvoted. The cold case stayed closed after that. No one tried to reopen the guest parking pilot program, no one tried to backdate violations, and no one tried to rewrite the minutes. The audio recordings became a permanent fixture, and homeowners started listening to them regularly to make sure the board was following through on its commitments. Transparency became the default, not the exception, and the neighborhood culture shifted from fear and compliance to engagement and accountability. I stayed on the board for 2 years, and then I stepped down to focus on my job and my recovery. My knee healed, the neighborhood stayed quiet, and I never had to use the trump card recording again. But I kept it, along with all the other evidence, in a folder on my encrypted backup drive, just in case. Looking back, the thing that strikes me most about the whole situation is how easy it was for Teresa to operate unchecked for so long. She did not have a master plan or a criminal syndicate. She just had access, authority, and the confidence to rewrite the rules in real time. And she got away with it, because no one wanted to fight, no one wanted to dig, and no one wanted to be the problem resident who questioned the board. Marcus tried, and he got crushed by procedural delays and legal threats. I tried, and I had better tools, better timing, and better luck. But the system itself was broken, and it stayed broken until someone forced it to change. That is the lesson I took from this. HOA governance is only as good as the people willing to hold it accountable. If you let one person control the records, manipulate the minutes, and weaponize the rules, you will end up with corruption, abuse, and a neighborhood that runs on fear instead of trust. But if you ask questions, demand documentation, and refuse to back down when the answers do not add up, You can force transparency and accountability even in the most hostile environments. It is not easy, it is not fast, and it is not fun. But it works. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.